There are sins in human history that make us shudder the moment we hear about them. Not only because the act itself is wrong, but because of the way an entire society can walk into it step by step and barely even notice. The most frightening thing is not when people commit sin. The most frightening thing is when sin becomes normal. When the things that once made the conscience tremble are slowly accepted, then defended, and finally celebrated. Try to imagine a land thousands of years ago. A land that was not poor or backward at all. On the contrary, it was rich and full of life. Fields stretched beneath the sunlight and crops seemed to grow almost effortlessly. Trade routes were busy with caravans passing through every day. Markets were crowded with goods from across the ancient world. And the cities of Sodom were once symbols of wealth and prosperity. The people there were not born evil either. They were ordinary families, merchants, farmers, traders, parents raising children. They got married, built their lives, and were born and raised like any other community on earth. No one is born a monster, and that is exactly why their story is so terrifying. Because their collapse did not begin with a war. It did not begin with a natural disaster. It did not begin with an invasion from outside. It began with an idea. An idea so small that at first no one thought it could destroy an entire civilization. Scholars of tafsir have pointed out a detail that sends chills down the spine when you really think about it. There was once a point in human history when the sin this people committed had never existed anywhere else in the world. Not just in Sodom, but in every civilization before them. The Qur'an states this clearly. They committed an indecent act that no people before them had ever committed. That means that throughout all earlier history, the natural disposition Allah placed within human beings, the fitrah, had kept humanity away from it. No one had even thought of turning it into a way of life. So what changed? Who was the first to cross that boundary? Ancient historical reports say that the change did not begin with a major movement, but with one individual. A man began questioning the moral limits that his society had always lived by. At first, his question sounded almost reasonable. Why should people be bound by old rules? Why not explore whatever brings personal pleasure? If something does not seem to cause immediate harm, is it really wrong? Questions like that carry a dangerous appeal. Because they do not appear in the form of sin, they appear in the form of curiosity. And in that moment, a door opened. But what makes this story even more terrifying is a truth many people fail to notice. Iblis did not need to force them through that door. He did not need to drag them into sin. He only needed to whisper. He only needed to plant an idea in the human mind and then step back. Human beings walked the rest of the way on their own. And when the first person crossed that line, what happened next became even more dangerous. There was no thunder, no natural disaster, no immediate punishment from the sky. The next morning, the sun still rose. The markets still opened. Life kept going as usual. And in the mind of the one who had sinned, a new thought began to form. Maybe it is not as wrong as I once thought. That is one of the most dangerous traps Shaitan sets for human beings. When Allah delays His punishment, many people confuse the patience of Allah with the approval of Allah. From one person, the story began spreading to others. A secret was shared with a close friend. That friend tried it once out of curiosity. 2 became 4. 4 became a small group. At first, everything happened in secret. Those involved still felt ashamed. They knew what they were doing went against the natural human disposition. But over time, the sense of shame began to weaken. Small conversations began appearing in hidden corners of society. People with the same inclination found one another. They began defending one another. They began creating new explanations to justify their behavior. Language started changing too. 8 words once used to describe a wrong act were gradually replaced with terms that sounded more acceptable. And when language changes, the way people think changes Maha as well. Within just a few generations, what had once been hidden in darkness slowly stepped into the light. A personal behavior became a trend became a culture, and eventually an entire society began defining itself by the very thing their ancestors would have trembled even to imagine. But what they did not realize was that with every step deeper into that path, they were moving closer to a moment history would never forget. A moment when a prophet would walk into their city with a warning. And when that warning was mocked, a night would come when the heavens and the earth themselves would become witnesses to the judgment of Allah. Nun, welcome to Prophetic History Explained, where we explore the deepest stories from the history of the prophets. If you want to keep following powerful and meaningful stories like this, subscribe to the channel right now to support us and help give us the motivation to bring you more valuable videos in the future. Because this story has only just begun, and what happens next will show you why a land that was once so prosperous eventually became one of the most frightening remnants in human history. If the opening of this story is a picture of a land once filled with blessings, then the next part is the story of how a society can slide downward without even realizing it is falling. The corruption of that people did not happen overnight. It did not begin with public acts or open declarations of defiance. Instead, it started with very small moments, thoughts that seemed harmless, whispers in the human mind that at first glance did not look dangerous at all. When scholars of history and tafsir look back at the collapse of this society, they often emphasize one point. Evil rarely first appears in its most terrifying form. It does not come with horns and fire, it comes with explanations that sound reasonable. It comes with questions that make people feel as if they are thinking freely, exploring something new, moving beyond old boundaries they now think are outdated. At first, it was just one person beginning to think differently. Perhaps he felt that the moral standards his society had upheld for generations were too strict. Perhaps he believed human beings should be freer in the pursuit of pleasure and experience. And thoughts like that do not immediately horrify the people around them. On the contrary, when they are expressed cleverly, they can even sound philosophical. And this is exactly where Shaitan's strategy begins to work. Iblis does not need to push people into sin by force. He understands human nature far better than many realize. All he needs to do is plant a seed in the mind to make what is forbidden seem worth considering, and human beings will do the rest themselves. When the first person crossed that line, something strange happened. There was no immediate punishment. There was no sign from the heavens to make him stop. Life continued as normal. The sun still rose every morning. Trade routes remained active. Markets stayed loud with bargaining and exchange. That silence created a dangerous illusion. In the mind of the one who sinned, a thought began growing larger. If this is truly so wrong, why is nothing happening? If this is absolutely forbidden, why does heaven not punish it immediately? This is one of the most subtle traps Shaitan uses against human beings. People easily confuse the patience of Allah with the approval of Allah. They forget that Allah may delay His judgment in order to give people a chance to turn back. But instead of turning back, that first person became more confident. He shared his secret with a close friend, perhaps at first in a conversation that was half serious and half joking. The friend may have felt shocked at first, but curiosity is a powerful force in the human mind. When an idea is repeated enough times, it gradually loses the fear it once carried. The second person tried it once, perhaps with guilt, perhaps with hesitation. But then, just like the first, he also noticed that life continued. Nothing changed immediately. That weakened the remaining fear in their minds. 2 became 4. 4 became a small group. At first, everything remained hidden. The people involved still knew the society around them would not accept this behavior. They met in secluded places and spoke in hints outsiders would not understand. At that stage, conscience was still alive. They still felt shame. And that shame was proof that the natural human disposition had not yet been completely broken. But time is dangerous when people keep repeating a wrongful act. As people with the same inclination began finding one another, they slowly created a private space where they no longer felt judged. In those spaces, justifications began to appear. Yet they told one another that what they were doing was not hurting anyone. They said society simply did not understand them. They said perhaps the old rules were only products of earlier generations. Language began changing in subtle ways. Words once used to describe deviant behavior were gradually replaced with terms that sounded more neutral, even positive. And when the names change, the thinking changes with them. What once made people shudder at the thought of it gradually became part of ordinary conversation. Within just a few decades, what had begun as the secret act of one individual grew into a widespread phenomenon. Those involved no longer saw themselves as wrongdoers. They began seeing themselves as people simply living true to themselves. But they did not realize that in the process, an invisible boundary was being erased. And the boundary between right and wrong does not disappear all at once. It gets worn down little by little. And when a society loses the ability to recognize that boundary, corruption is no longer the problem of a single individual. It becomes the character of an entire civilization. When a society goes too far down the path of error, what changes is not just the behavior of a few individuals. What changes is the way the entire community understands right and wrong. And that is when corruption enters a far more dangerous stage. What was once hidden in darkness no longer needs to be hidden. What once made people act in secrecy and fear begins to be spoken about openly and then gradually becomes normal in daily life. In the cities of Sodom, this transformation happened slowly but steadily. A new generation grew up in an atmosphere where the old moral standards had already begun to shake. The children born later no longer witnessed the shame the earlier generation had once felt. To them, the things once considered wrong were now simply part of the society they had known since childhood. And when a behavior is seen often enough, it begins to lose its sense of abnormality. That is how a culture is formed. The people of those cities began speaking about their behavior not with hesitation but with confidence. Their conversations no longer revolved around whether it was wrong. Instead, they began asking why others objected to it. That reversal in thinking is the sign of a society entering a dangerous stage, when the people committing wrongdoing no longer feel they are wrong, but begin seeing those who oppose them as the real problem. In that setting, Allah sent them a prophet, Prophet Lut. His arrival was not random. In the history of nations, whenever people move close to the edge of corruption, Allah sends them someone to remind them, someone to call them back to the right path before it is too late. Lut lived among them as one of their own. He saw the change in his society day by day. He watched as behavior that once brought shame was now spoken of as something normal. And he knew that if no one spoke up, that corruption would keep spreading until no one even remembered that things had once been different. So he began warning them. Lut's call was not a threat from the beginning. He spoke to them with the sincerity of someone who wanted to save his people, and he reminded them that what they were doing was something no people before them had ever done. He called them back to the limits Allah had set for human beings, limits established not to restrict people, but to protect them from their own destruction. But the response of the people of Sodom was not reflection. At first, they simply mocked him. To them, Lut's warning sounded like the voice of someone outdated, someone clinging to old values. They assumed he simply did not understand the changes in society. And the more people in the community shared that same attitude, the smaller the warning voice of one man became in the middle of the crowd. As time passed, that mockery slowly turned into hostility. The people grew irritated whenever Lut reminded them of what they did not want to hear. His presence became a constant reminder that a moral standard still existed, a standard they were violating. And instead of changing their behavior, they chose an easier path, removing the voice that made them feel judged. But the corruption of Sodom did not stop there. When wrongdoing becomes the norm in a society, it starts affecting the way that community treats other people. Strangers passing through that land were no longer seen as guests or merchants deserving welcome. Instead, they became targets for humiliation and cruelty. Caravans that once passed through those cities began changing their routes. Traders from faraway places heard terrifying stories about how the people there treated outsiders. And little by little, the trade routes that had once brought wealth to that land began to grow quiet, and that was a clear sign that their society was isolating itself. But instead of seeing it as the consequence of their own behavior, the people of Sodom reacted with anger. They did not ask themselves why others were avoiding them. They simply felt the world was judging them unfairly. In their minds, they were not the ones in the wrong. They were the ones living according to what they believed was right. And anyone who opposed them, whether travelers or a prophet sent by Allah, was seen as an enemy. That is the point where a society begins to lose the ability to examine itself. When no one is willing to listen to warning anymore, when voices calling for what is right are mocked and pushed aside, then the foundations of a civilization begin to crack. Because a society does not collapse simply because sin exists within it. A society collapses when it no longer recognizes that those sins exist at all. And in Sodom, that moment was drawing very near. Time passed, and Lut's warnings kept echoing through the city, but they no longer seemed to touch anyone's heart. Many years had gone by since he began his mission. He had spoken to them with the patience of a prophet, with the earnestness of someone trying to save his people from disaster. He had reminded them that the path they were on would lead to consequences beyond anything they could imagine. But for the people of Sodom, his words had become nothing more than a lonely voice in a society whose moral standards had been completely turned upside down. In their eyes, Lut was no longer someone who wanted good for the community. He had become a symbol of the values they wanted to forget. His existence was like a mirror forcing them to face the truth about themselves. And instead of changing themselves, they chose to mock and reject the man holding that mirror. Then one day, something happened that threw the entire city into a state of excitement unlike anything before. 3 strangers appeared at the city gate. They were not ordinary merchants, nor did they look like tired travelers after a long journey. Their appearance was so striking that anyone who saw them would pause. They were young men of extraordinary beauty, with radiant faces and a presence that drew every eye. But those strangers were not human. They were angels sent by Allah with a mission already decreed. 3 mighty angels, Jibril, Mikael, and Israfil, messengers who had witnessed the formation of the world and carried power beyond human imagination. But on that day, they entered the city in human form as part of the final test for that people. The first person to realize the danger of the situation was not one of the men in the city, but Lut's daughter. The moment she saw the strangers at the city gate, she felt deep fear. She knew the nature of the society she lived in. She knew what would happen if the men of the city saw them. She ran home in panic to tell her father. And when Lut heard the news, he understood immediately how serious it was. He rushed to the city gate, trying to bring the guests into his house before too many people noticed them. In the culture of the ancient world, protecting a guest was a sacred duty. Once a person entered your home as a guest, you were honor-bound to protect them at any cost. But Lut knew that sacred code was no longer respected in that city. and he hurried them into his home, hoping that if everything happened quickly enough, perhaps no one would notice. But he underestimated how quickly rumors spread in a society already used to hunting down strangers. Curious eyes had seen them. Whispers began spreading through the narrow alleys of the city. One person told another that strange men had arrived. Someone else said they were in Lut's house. And within a short time, the news spread through the city like fire carried by the wind. As the sun began to set, footsteps started gathering outside Lut's home. At first, it was only a few people standing outside, talking among themselves with curiosity. But then the number grew. Small groups merged together, and before long a large crowd had formed at the door of Lut's house. They did not come to greet him. They came for one reason only, and the first knocks came at the door, at first only hard pounding. But very quickly the pounding turned into violent blows. Voices began shouting from outside, demanding that Lut bring the guests out. Inside the small house, Lut stood before the door with a heavy heart. His two daughters stood behind him, frightened by the sound of the crowd growing more aggressive outside. Meanwhile, the guests he had just welcomed into his home sat with a strange calmness, as though they were not worried at all by what was happening outside. Lut knew he had to do something. He opened the door just a little, enough to speak with the crowd without letting them rush in. Before him was a sight that made his heart ache. Faces he had known for years, neighbors, men who had once traded with him, were now staring at him with lust and anger. He spoke to them with all the urgency he had. He reminded them to fear Allah. He told them the people in his house were his guests and were under the protection of his honor as a host. He begged them to go home. But the crowd only laughed. In desperation, Lut even made an offer he probably never imagined he would have to make. He reminded them that lawful women existed in the city for them to marry, that there were proper paths Allah had already made permissible. He pleaded with them to return to what Allah had allowed, but their answer made his heart sink. They told him they had no interest in that at all. They told him he knew very well what they wanted, and they demanded that he stop wasting their time. In that moment, Lut understood that his society had gone so far that it could no longer hear any warning. And outside the door, the crowd was growing more aggressive by the second, as if they were ready to smash the door apart to get what they wanted. The door of Lut's house shook under the violent blows from outside. The shouting of the crowd mixed with the cracking sound of wood, as if everything might collapse within moments. Inside that small house, the air felt heavy and suffocating. Lut stood at the door with a heart full of despair. He knew he was only one man facing hundreds who had been consumed by desire and rage. He had tried speaking, tried persuading, tried reminding them of Allah, but all of it had been useless. The crowd outside was no longer hearing any words at all. They were hearing only their own desires. And when a society reaches that state, reason is no longer enough to stop it. Lut turned and looked at the guests inside his home, and in the dim light of the room their faces remained strangely calm, completely different from the chaos building outside. That calmness confused him. He could not understand how they could remain so composed when only one door separated them from a mob ready to destroy everything. Then one of the guests stood up. In that moment, the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. It no longer felt like an encounter among ordinary human beings. An unseen power seemed to spread through the space, and that guest said something to Lut that left him stunned. They were not travelers, they were the angels of Allah. The one standing before Lut was Jibril, the angel who had brought revelation to prophets, the angel with enough power to shake entire cities. The others were angels sent by Allah to carry out a mission decreed long ago. Jibril told Lut that he had nothing to fear. The crowd outside would never be able to touch him or the guests inside the house. Lut's mission had been completed. He had warned his people for many years. He had patiently called them back to the straight path. And now the time of warning had ended. The time of judgment had begun. At that moment, Jibril commanded Lut to leave the city during the night. He had to take the believers from his household and go before dawn appeared. And there was one clear condition. As they left, they were not to turn back and look behind them no matter what they heard. But Jibril also told Lut a painful truth. Not everyone in his household would be saved. Lut's wife had sided with her people all along. Her heart had never truly believed in her husband's warnings. And because of that, she would face the same fate as the people she had chosen to stand with. Meanwhile, outside the door, the mob kept shouting and pounding. But then suddenly a strange silence fell. A moment later, screams rang out through the street. But they were no longer screams of anger. They were screams of panic. Jibril needed only a single motion, one sweep of his wing, unseen by human eyes. And instantly the men at Lut's door were stripped of their sight. The eyes that had looked at what was forbidden with satisfaction could see no longer. They staggered, slammed into one another, and stumbled through the streets. But what made the scene even more terrifying was that even in that condition, they still refused to stop. They kept shouting, kept threatening, still believing that the next day they would return and take revenge on Lut. And they did not realize that tomorrow would never come. While chaos spread through the city, Lut quickly took his 2 daughters and left the house. They moved through the night, leaving behind the streets where they had lived for so many years. Behind them, the city was still lit, but no one inside it knew that its final hours had begun. Once Lut and his daughters were far enough away, the judgment of Allah began. Jibril descended beneath the ground of those cities. His immense wings spread beneath the cities, beneath the homes, the markets, the roads where the people had once lived. Then by the power Allah gave him, he lifted that entire region up from the earth. The cities that had stood for generations suddenly shook. Their foundations tore away from the earth as if the whole world were being turned upside down. Scholars say Jibril lifted them so high that the angels in the lowest heaven could hear the sounds of the animals inside the cities. In that moment, their entire civilization hung suspended between heaven and earth. Then Jibril turned them over. The cities that had once been full of laughter, glowing with lights and wealth, were hurled back down to the earth in a terrible collapse. But that was not the end. From the sky, stones began to fall, not random stones. The Qur'an says they were marked, each one aimed at a specific person. Every stone found exactly the one it had been assigned to. When the sun rose the next morning, the place where 7 crowded cities had once stood was nothing but a devastated wasteland. No human voices, no life. Only cracked ground and a pool of salty water gathered in the valley. And that place later became known as the Dead Sea. A body of water where no living creature can survive, standing as the remnant of one of the most fearsome judgments in human history. And that story was not preserved merely as a memory of the past, but as a warning to every generation about what happens when a society crosses every limit Allah has set for humanity. This story teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of corruption. It rarely happens overnight. It does not arrive like a sudden storm. It comes slowly, beginning with the small things people allow themselves to overlook. A thought, an action, a small justification. When those things are repeated enough times, they begin to feel normal. And when an entire society starts calling what is wrong right, the road back to truth becomes harder than ever. But the story of Prophet Lut is not only a warning, it is also a reminder that every individual is responsible for his own choices. Lut lived in the middle of a society that opposed everything he called them to, yet he never stopped speaking the truth. He did not change his message to fit the crowd. He did not stay silent in order to be accepted. And he did not give up even when he knew he was standing almost alone. That steadfastness is a powerful lesson for anyone living in a world where social pressure can make people hesitate to defend what is right. For us today, this story is a reminder that each of us must look carefully at ourselves and at the society around us. The things we listen to, the values we accept, and the actions we treat as normal all help shape the future of our community. If we are not careful, history can repeat itself in ways we never expect. But if we learn from the stories Allah preserved in the Qur'an, we can recognize the signs of error before it is too late and choose a different path. If you want to keep exploring deep and meaningful stories from the history of the prophets, join the Prophetic History Explained community so we can continue learning together from the lessons of the Qur'an, from the lives of the prophets, and from the events that shaped human history. These stories do not only help us understand the past, they also help us understand our own lives more clearly today. And if you found this content valuable, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support the channel. Your support will help give us the motivation to continue creating more meaningful videos, bringing powerful stories and deep lessons that all of us can learn from and apply in our lives.